You're becoming a slave to pleasure. Here's how Dostoevsky would stop it. We live in a time where the pursuit of pleasure is not only celebrated but marketed, sold, and consumed in every possible form. Think about your day. How often do you reach for your phone to check notifications? How many times do you feel the pull of instant gratification, whether it's through social media, food, shopping, or even entertainment? We're constantly bombarded with stimuli, and it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that by indulging in these pleasures, we are somehow living our most free lives. But are we? The truth is, the more we chase pleasure, the more we become its slave. Dostoevsky, one of the greatest Russian novelists and philosophers, understood this deeply. He recognized that while pleasure may feel like freedom in the moment, it often leads to a deeper form of enslavement. In fact, Dostoevsky would argue that the very act of chasing pleasure blinds us to the more significant, more meaningful aspects of existence. And this is where we find ourselves today, seduced by instant gratification, but disconnected from the true depths of life. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you sat in silence, without any distractions, and simply existed? For many of us, the idea of doing nothing is terrifying. We fear boredom, we fear discomfort, but most of all, we fear ourselves. We fear confronting the emptiness that often lies beneath the surface of our pleasure-seeking behavior. Dostoevsky would tell us that this fear is precisely why we must stop. He would advise us to embrace our discomfort, to lean into the silence, because only in the absence of pleasure can we begin to understand what truly matters. But how do we do this? How do we break free from the chains of pleasure that bind us so tightly? The first step is awareness. We must begin to recognize the patterns in our own behavior, the habits, the impulses, the mindless consumption of pleasure. We need to ask ourselves what we are running from. Why do we feel the need to fill every moment with stimulation? Is it because we're afraid of what we might find if we turn inward? Or is it because we've been conditioned to believe that life is only meaningful when it's pleasurable? Once we become aware of these tendencies, we can start to make conscious choices. Dostoevsky believed in the power of suffering, not needless suffering, but the kind of suffering that comes from confronting the truth of our existence. He would argue that only by facing our discomfort head-on can we begin to experience true freedom. This is the paradox of pleasure. The more we avoid discomfort, the more we suffer in the long run. But if we embrace suffering, we can transcend it.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound spiritual lesson.
Think about this. What would your life look like if you stopped chasing pleasure? Would you feel empty, or would you begin to discover something deeper? Dostoevsky believed that the human spirit is capable of extraordinary things, but only if we are willing to confront the darkness within ourselves. And this is where the real journey begins, when we stop seeking external validation and begin to explore the inner landscape of our own minds. So, the next time you feel the urge to reach for your phone or indulge in some fleeting pleasure, ask yourself, what am I really seeking? Is it happiness, or is it a distraction? And more importantly, what would Dostoevsky tell me to do at this moment? Would he encourage me to indulge, or would he challenge me to sit with my discomfort and see what I can learn from it? Confronting the abyss, why suffering leads to freedom. Dostoevsky wasn't shy about the darker aspects of human existence. In his novels, we often encounter characters who are deeply flawed, struggling with inner turmoil, moral uncertainty, and a profound sense of alienation. These characters, while tragic, are also deeply human. Dostoevsky's works force us to confront a difficult truth: life is filled with suffering. But here's the paradox: through suffering, we can find freedom. When we talk about suffering, it's important to distinguish between two types. There's the kind of suffering that's imposed upon us: illness, loss, the inevitable tragedies of life. This type of suffering is often beyond our control. But then there's another kind, the suffering that comes from within, from the conflict between our desires and our reality. This is the suffering that Dostoevsky is most interested in. It's the kind of suffering that arises when we realize that our pursuit of pleasure, of constant distraction, only deepens our sense of emptiness. So why does suffering lead to freedom? It seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? After all, isn't freedom about escaping suffering, about finding joy and happiness? That's what we're told. But Dostoevsky would argue that true freedom isn't about the absence of suffering, it's about confronting it, understanding it, and ultimately transcending it. In fact, he believed that the avoidance of suffering, the constant pursuit of pleasure, is what traps us in a cycle of dependency. Think about it: when you chase after pleasure, what happens when it's gone? You're left wanting more. The satisfaction you feel is fleeting, and the more you indulge, the more you need. It's like a drug: the more you consume, the more you require just to feel the same level of satisfaction. This is the insidious nature of pleasure. It never truly satisfies. It only deepens your craving. Now, contrast this with suffering. When we suffer, we are forced to confront the reality of our existence. We can no longer hide behind the distractions of pleasure. In those moments of pain, we are stripped bare, vulnerable, and exposed to the truth. And while it's uncomfortable, while it's painful, it's also liberating. Because in suffering, we are no longer chasing after something external. We are simply present with ourselves, in the rawest, most honest way possible. Dostoevsky's characters often reach moments of profound clarity in the midst of their suffering. Think of Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, who wrestles with the consequences of his actions, or the underground man in Notes from Underground, who is consumed by his own bitterness and isolation. These characters are not happy in the conventional sense, but they are deeply aware. They see the world and themselves with a clarity that is impossible to achieve when we are lost in the pursuit of pleasure. So what does this mean for us? How can we apply Dostoevsky's philosophy to our own lives? It starts with a simple but difficult truth: we must stop running from suffering. Instead of constantly seeking to avoid pain, we should learn to sit with it, to understand it, and to grow from it. This doesn't mean we should seek out suffering for its own sake. Dostoevsky was not a masochist, but he believed that when suffering inevitably comes, we should face it head-on, rather than numbing ourselves with distractions. Let me ask you something. What is the last thing that truly made you suffer? Was it a loss, a failure, a moment of deep insecurity? And how did you respond to that suffering? Did you try to escape it, to drown it in pleasure? Or did you allow yourself to truly feel it, to understand what it was trying to teach you? You see, suffering is not the enemy. It is, in many ways, our greatest teacher. It forces us to confront the parts of ourselves that we would rather ignore. It strips away the illusions we build around ourselves, the illusion that we can find lasting happiness in pleasure, the illusion that we are in control of our lives. And once those illusions are gone, what's left is the truth. And the truth, while often painful, is the only thing that can set us free. Dostoevsky believed that freedom comes not from indulging our desires, but from understanding them. It comes from recognizing that life is not about constant pleasure, but about finding meaning in the midst of suffering. And that meaning, once discovered, is far more valuable than any fleeting pleasure. So, the next time you feel the pull of distraction, of instant gratification, I challenge you to pause. Ask yourself, what am I avoiding? What discomfort am I trying to escape? And what would happen if I allowed myself to confront that discomfort, to sit with it, and to learn from it? The power of choice resisting the temptation of pleasure. One of Dostoevsky's most profound insights is the idea that human beings are defined by their choices. We are not simply passive creatures, moved by pleasure or pain like animals. We have the capacity to reflect, to choose, and to act based on something deeper than pure instinct. Yet, in a world that constantly tempts us with fleeting pleasures, this capacity for choice often feels like an illusion. We are told, implicitly and explicitly, that the good life is one filled with endless indulgence, comfort, and ease. But Dostoevsky would argue that this is precisely the kind of life that leads us to spiritual ruin. Here's the dilemma: in a society that places such high value on pleasure, how do we even begin to resist? How do we exercise our freedom of choice when everything around us is designed to make us submit to our desires? The answer lies in understanding that true freedom is not about doing whatever we want whenever we want. True freedom is about having the strength to say no to the things that enslave us. Dostoevsky saw this struggle for freedom most vividly in the context of moral choice. His characters are often faced with situations that force them to choose between what is easy and what is right. Take, for example, Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. He believes that by committing murder, he will be liberated from the constraints of morality, that he will be free to live according to his own desires. But what he finds instead is that this act of freedom leads him into a prison of guilt and torment. His attempt to transcend morality leaves him enslaved by his own conscience. The lesson here is clear: freedom without boundaries is not freedom at all. It is chaotic, and pleasure, when pursued without limits, becomes a form of enslavement. The more we give in to our desires, the less control we have over them. It's a vicious cycle, one that Dostoevsky understood all too well. He would argue that the only way to truly be free is to impose limits on ourselves. We must learn to resist the temptations that promise us momentary satisfaction but ultimately lead to emptiness. But this resistance is not easy. It requires discipline, self-awareness, and, most importantly, a willingness to confront the discomfort that comes with saying no. When we resist pleasure, we often experience a kind of withdrawal. We feel restless, anxious, and uncertain. But this discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. It's a sign that we are growing. It's a sign that we are learning to live not according to our impulses, but according to our values. Let me ask you this: when was the last time you made a difficult choice, one that required you to sacrifice immediate pleasure for something deeper, something more meaningful? How did that choice make you feel? Did you feel empowered, or did you feel like you were missing out? And if you felt like you were missing out, I challenge you to think about what you were really missing. Was it something of lasting value, or was it just another fleeting moment of satisfaction? Ultimately, Dostoevsky would tell us that resisting pleasure is not about denying ourselves joy. It's about finding joy in the things that truly matter. Pleasure is not inherently bad, but when it becomes the sole focus of our lives, we lose sight of the things that give life meaning: our relationships, our sense of purpose, our connection to something greater than ourselves. And it's in these things, not in the endless pursuit of pleasure, that we find true fulfillment. Finding meaning beyond pleasure, the path to true fulfillment. So, where does this leave us? If pleasure is not the ultimate goal, if it can lead to enslavement rather than freedom, what are we supposed to pursue in its place? Dostoevsky's answer to this question is both simple and profound meaning. The pursuit of meaning, not pleasure, is what leads to a life of true fulfillment. But what does it mean to pursue meaning, and how does it differ from the pursuit of pleasure? The key difference lies in the depth and permanence of the experiences we're chasing. Pleasure is fleeting; it satisfies us for a moment, but then it's gone. leaving us craving more. Meaning, on the other hand, is enduring. It provides us with a sense of purpose, a reason for being that transcends the momentary highs and lows of life. Dostoevsky believed that meaning comes from a few key sources: love, compassion, and moral responsibility. In his later works, particularly The Brothers Karamazov, he explores the idea that the highest form of human existence is found in selfless love for others, love for God, love for something greater than ourselves. This kind of love requires sacrifice. It requires us to prioritize the well-being of others over our own desires. And while this may seem like a denial of pleasure, Dostoevsky would argue that it is, in fact, the source of the deepest joy we can experience. In loving others, we transcend our own selfishness. We break free from the prison of our desires and find a connection to something more meaningful. And in that connection, we find true freedom. This is why Dostoevsky's characters, despite their suffering, often find moments of profound grace and redemption. They learn that life is not about satisfying their own desires, but about serving something greater. But how do we apply this to our own lives? How do we shift from a pleasure-centered existence to one rooted in meaning? The first step is to redefine what success looks like. In a world that constantly tells us that happiness comes from material wealth, physical comfort, and personal gratification, we must consciously choose to value something different. We must choose to seek out relationships that challenge us, work that fulfills us, and causes that inspire us. This is not an easy path. It requires us to resist the pull of instant gratification and embrace the harder, but more rewarding, work of building a meaningful life. It requires us to ask ourselves difficult questions: what am I living for? What do I value most? What legacy do I want to leave behind? These questions force us to look beyond our immediate desires and consider the bigger picture. Let me ask you, what gives your life meaning? Is it your relationships, your work, your faith, or are you still searching for that deeper sense of purpose? And if you're searching, what steps are you taking to find it? Are you willing to endure discomfort, sacrifice, and even suffering in the pursuit of something greater than yourself? Dostoevsky would tell us that the search for meaning is not a one-time decision, it's an ongoing process. Every day, we are faced with choices that either bring us closer to or farther away from a meaningful life. And while pleasure will always be tempting, we must remember that true fulfillment comes not from indulging in fleeting desires, but from living with purpose. In the end, Dostoevsky's philosophy is not about rejecting pleasure entirely. It's about placing it in its proper context. Pleasure is a part of life, but it's not the point of life. The point of life is to live deeply, to love fully, and to find meaning in the everyday moments that, when strung together, create a life well lived. So, the next time you're faced with the choice between immediate pleasure and something deeper, ask yourself, what would Dostoevsky do? Would he choose the easy path, or would he choose the one that leads to meaning, even if it's harder? Because in the end, it's the harder path, the one that requires sacrifice, responsibility, and love, that leads to true freedom.